Hey guys, welcome to another lesson of learning Japanese. Today we have a really hard-hitting subject to talk about, and that is the verb conjugation of the te form. So the te form is a really important verb conjugation, and it has so many different functions and definitions basically that we won't be able to go through all the definitions in this video. What we're going to do as an introduction is basically just show how to conjugate different verbs into their te form, and in later videos we will devote entire full-length lessons to respective definitions or functions that the te form has. For now, what I can say is that the te form is probably most commonly used to connect verbs in the sense of did this and did this, and it is also pretty commonly used to express a demand, an imperative kind of sentence, in that you're telling somebody to do something. And other than that, there are definitely a bunch of different functions, but those two seem to be the most prominent that I can come up to mind right now. But yeah, don't worry, we'll go through them in time. Okay, so now for a very long introduction to conjugating verbs into the te form. So first up, we're gonna talk about ru-verbs, and to conjugate ru-verbs into their te form, what you're just going to do is you're going to take the dictionary form of the ru verb, you're going to drop the ru at the end, and you're going to replace it with the te. And that is pretty simple. Some examples. We have the verb osieru, which means to teach basically, or to show. We drop the ru at the end, so we have oshie, and then we add the te, so we have oshiete. We have the ru verb taberu, which means to eat. We drop the ru at the end, we add a te, so it's tabete. And yeah, it goes on like this for all the other ru verbs as well, but we do have two irregular ru verbs that don't follow this guideline and have their own unique conjugation, and those two verbs are kuru and suru, the two verbs that are usually irregular verbs in all verb conjugations basically. So for kuru, you're not only going to drop the ru and replace it with te, but you're also going to change ku into ki. So instead of kute, which sounds really crazy, it's going to be kite instead. And for suru, we basically have the same thing. We're not only going to drop the ru and change it to a te, we're going to change the su at the beginning and change it into a shi. So instead of sute, which sounds also crazy, it's gonna be shite. Okay, so we got ru verbs down. Now we're gonna move on to u verbs. So for u verbs, we do have a condition. We have to know what character the u verb ends in. So first off, we're gonna evaluate u verbs that end with the character su. So for u verbs that end in the character su, to turn it into the te form, we're gonna drop the su at the end and replace it with shite. Shite, just like the te form of the verb suru. So for example, we have the u verb korosu, which means to kill. If we want to change that to the te form, we drop the su at the end and replace it with shite, so it's koroshite. Similarly, we have the verb hanasu, which means to talk, and we're gonna drop the su at the end and we're gonna replace it with shite, so it's hanashite. Okay, so that's the u verbs with su at the end. So now we're gonna evaluate the u verbs that end with the character u, or the character su. And when I say su this time, this is tsu, not su, so bear that in mind, it's really important. So with these u verbs, we're going to drop the final character, which is either going to be u or su, as I just said, and we're going to replace that with a strong te. And when I say strong te, it means that the small su is preceding the te, so it's going to be te. So let's go through some examples. For our first one, we have the u verb sukao, which is to use. We notice that it ends with the character u, so we drop the u and then we add the strong te, so it's going to be sukatte. And of course, notice that in the pronunciation there's going to be a kind of emphasis on the te at the end, so sukatte instead of sukatte. For our next one, we have the u verb utao, and this is to sing. It ends with u, and we're going to drop that u and we're going to replace it with te, so it's going to be utatte. For our next two examples, we have verbs that end with su. So we have the verb matsu, which is to wait. We're going to drop the su and we're going to add the strong te, so it's going to be matte. Next, we have the verb motsu, which is kind of hard to translate. It means like either to possess, to have, to hold, to carry, but it ends with su. We're going to drop that su and we're going to place it with a strong te, so it's going to be motte. So that's what we have for the u verbs that end with the character u or su. Now we move into the u verbs that end with the character ku. So to conjugate u verbs that end with the character ku, we're going to drop the ku at the end and we're going to replace it with ite, which is e and te. There's no small su in between them or anything to denote a emphasis on the te or anything. It's just ite. So for our first example, we have the word kaku, which is to write. We're gonna drop the ku at the end. We're gonna replace that with ite, so it's gonna be kaite. For next one, we have the verb kiku, which is to listen. There's a ku at the end. We're gonna drop that, replace that with ite, so it is kite. And notice that there are indeed technically two I's in that if you translate that into English. Next, we have u-verbs that end with the character gu. And when we change these characters into the te form, we're gonna replace the gu with ide. And this is very similar to the ku guideline. Instead of ite, it's just going to be ide. And of course, de is just technically te with the daku ten, the two like quotation like sign. So you can see how there's a similarity in concept as well. So for example, for gu verbs, we have the verb oyogu, which is to swim. If we want to change that into its te form, we're going to drop the gu, add ide, so it's going to be oyoide. Next, we have u-verbs that end with nu, bu, or mu. And to conjugate these into their te form, we're going to drop the final particle, whether that be mu, nu, or bu, and we're going to replace that with an nde, which is the consonant n and de. So for example, we have the first one, which is shinu. That is a u-verb that ends with nu. We're going to drop the nu, replace it with nde, and it's going to be shinde. Next, we have asobu. It's a u-verb that ends with bu. It means to play, and we're going to drop the bu. We're going to replace it with nde, so it's going to be asonde. And next, we have a very common verb, yomu, which means to read. It ends with the character mu. We drop that mu, replace it with nde, so it's going to be yonde. Now, last for the u-verbs, we have u-verbs that end in the character ru. And you might be asking, whoa, what the heck is the difference between u-verbs that end with ru and just plain out ru verbs? And the distinction exists. Unfortunately, it makes our life harder, but you just have to come and pick onto these, which one is an u-verb and which is a ru verb over time, because it is basically impossible to tell unless you have experience witnessing the conjugation itself. So the distinction between ru verbs and u verbs that end in ru, you can tell most easily by conjugating these verbs into their mas form. When ru verbs are conjugated into their mas form, you drop the ru and you replace it with mas. But when u verbs that end with ru are conjugated into their mas form, you drop the ru, but you don't replace it with mas, you replace it with rimas. So for example, the verb taberu is a ru verb. When you conjugate that into its mas form, it's going to be tabemasu because you drop the ru and you replace it with mas. On the other hand, we have the verb gambaru, which ends in a ru, so you might think it's a ru verb, but it's not. It's a u verb that ends with ru. And when you conjugate this into its mas form, it's going to be gambarimasu instead of gambamasu, which is not right at all. And you can see that instead of dropping the ru and replacing it with mas, we drop the ru and replace it with rimas, and that's how you can tell that that is an u verb that ends in ru, not a ru verb. Okay, so now that we've explained that distinction, let's talk about how to change the u verbs that end in ru into their te form. To do that, we're simply going to drop the ru at the end of the u verb, and we're going to replace that with the strong te, as in the te that has a small su before it to emphasize the te, basically. For example, we have the word gambaru again. If we want to change that to its te form, we drop the ru at the end and we replace it with the strong te, so it's going to be gambatte. Similarly, we have the verb sukuru, which means to make. It is an u verb that ends with a ru, so we drop the ru at the end and we replace it with a strong te, so it's going to be sukutte. So there we go. We've done it. We've covered how to conjugate ru verbs and all kinds of u verbs into their te form, but we do have to mention one last one because this one is an irregular, and that is the verb iku, which means to go. So for iku, we're not going to conjugate it like a u verb with ku at the end or whatever. It has its own guideline. It's simply going to be ite, iku, you're gonna drop the ku and you're gonna add the strong te, so it's gonna be ite. So all together, if we take the suru and the kuru from the ru verb section and we include it with iku to represent this group of irregular, that means there are 3 verbs that are irregular and they don't follow the regular guidelines of conjugating the te form. So if you're trying to wrap your brain around it in that way, just know that there are basically 3 divisions. We have the ru verbs, we have the u verbs, which have like its own 10 subdivisions, but whatever. And then we have the irregulars, so that's 3 different ways to conjugate it, if we don't again include the freaking subdivisions of u-verbs. And yeah, that's how we conjugate verbs into their te form. This video has been longer than most, but it's actually going to take much more time than this video's length to get this down, so be sure to revisit how to do this. It's important because we are going to cover it in videos as to what the function of the te form is, and you're going to need to know these really simple basics by then. And yeah.